Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kaitlyn Budion. I am a fifth year journalism major, and this is actually my last semester at Northeastern. I'm graduating here in December. I also have a minor in history and a minor in women's gender and sexuality studies. So thank you all for coming to my presentation about my project, Revived and Moving Forward, the Equal Rights Amendment in 2020. And I worked on this with Professor Carleen Hempel. I just put the link in the chat to the website I made. So people, if you want to take the time to go explore the full website and read the complete pieces, you can do that. But just to get started, how I sort of came across this idea, I did not know anything about the Equal Rights Amendment before I came to college. It was not something that was ever discussed in my high school classes. I learned about it freshman year in a history class, and then it was sometimes mentioned in my women's gender and sexuality studies classes, but always very much in the past tense of this amendment in the 70s that tried to ban sex discrimination and failed. So I came back to the topic last fall when I was doing a small reporting article for class about activism in the 70s and 80s, and pretty immediately thought of the ERA. But I was really surprised when I went to do some research and found that there was a very real effort to pass the amendment now and to get it added to the Constitution. And then as I started to look into it, I found that pretty much all of the information I could come across was only provided by people who were advocating for the issue on either side. So there were groups who were very pro ERA, who had one very strong interpretation of how things would go and what it would do. And the opposing side had a very, very different but equally strong statements about what it would do and what the future of it was. And I was really struggling to figure out what would actually happen and what was sort of the reality of it, because I sort of had a feeling that it was probably somewhere in the middle. So my goal with this project was really to figure that out, get that information about what would happen, and then provide that for people to educate themselves. And so just to get started, I just want to give everyone a little bit of background information about the Equal Rights Amendment, because to understand what is going on now, you really have to understand how we got here. So the Equal Rights Amendment, the idea was first sort of brought up in the women's rights movement right after the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote. And it was around for quite a few years, but it didn't pass Congress until 1972. But when it passed Congress, Congress included a deadline for the ratification that said it had to be ratified by 1979, and that was later pushed back to 1982, but ultimately it was not fully ratified. The Constitution says an amendment needs to be ratified by 2/3 of the states, so that is 38 states out of 50, and the ERA made it to 35, but eventually fell just 3 short. And so for a long time, everyone involved assumed that the amendment was dead and would have to start over from scratch and get it passed through Congress again. But then things sort of changed in 1992 with an unrelated case, was that the 27th Amendment was ratified and added to the Constitution. It's commonly called the Madison Amendment. And the context of the amendment is what's important, not so much what it would do, because the Madison Amendment was passed by Congress over 200 years before it was fully ratified by the states. So everyone involved with the Equal Rights Amendment suddenly went, oh, so if we can get Congress to remove the deadline and finish ratifying in 3 more states, then the ERA would be added to the Constitution. So then what happens is in 2017, Nevada ratified the ERA. In 2018, Illinois did. And in January, at the beginning of this year, 2020, Virginia did, bringing the ERA technically to 38 states. But there is still the issue of the deadline, and the other major legal debate about the amendment has to do with, in the meantime, before those last 3 states ratified, 5 states passed motions to rescind their ratification. So that was Nebraska, Tennessee, Idaho, Kentucky, and South Dakota. So now there is also a debate about if states can rescind their ratification. And so if that were the case, then the ERA really only has been ratified in 33 states. So as all of this went on and I got started looking into this over the summer, realizing that we had hit 38 states really only increased my urge to want to dive into this issue because I think it is something that has really gotten overshadowed in the news by everything going on with the pandemic, which is absolutely understandable. But nonetheless, I think a constitutional amendment is a really big deal, and it's not something that a lot of people are aware of. And so as I got started on this project, I knew that I wanted to have more than one piece involved in it. So the second story I came up with is titled Not Helping All Women, How the ERA Represents a Trend of Failing to Support Women of Color. And so that came about, and as I started doing research for this project, and also in some of my classwork, I began to see this trend of how what we sort of consider to be the mainstream feminism and women's rights movements don't support women of color, especially Black women, and don't prioritize the issues most important to those women. Instead, they prioritize things like the Equal Rights Amendment that don't have an immediate impact on women's day-to-day lives. And this is sort of a trend that I saw going all the way back to the suffrage movement and coming up to today. And as I interviewed people about this, a lot of it has sort of come down, they said, to what we view as a women's issue. So a lot of the leaders of these movements tend to be white women who say they only want to focus on gender. They don't want to discuss or focus on issues of race. But ultimately, what that means is you're only prioritizing the issues that affect white women because you're privileged enough to not face the issues of race and racism. Because for Black women, issues of sex discrimination are just as real and immediate in their lives as issues of racial discrimination. So that was something I really wanted to be sure to include in this project because it sort of is the same point in the coverage of it of if you only look at it, the ERA, without looking at it through this lens of race, then you're really only talking about what it does for white women. And so overall, I'm really happy with how the piece turned out. I think the trend is really clear, but the sourcing wasn't exactly how I had imagined it at the beginning of the semester. I had hoped to get a couple more bigger names who are more relevant today and to talk about some more of the modern issues, which didn't happen. I reached out to a lot of people who said they were too busy, which I think is very understandable given the way things are this year. You know, it was also a major election year. People had a lot going on. And so I tried to supplement that sometimes by talking about things that have other people have written. For example, Nikki Kendall is an author of the book Hood Feminism, and she has talked a lot about this sort of thing. And I reached out to her for an interview, but she was unavailable. So I included some stuff from her book and a piece she had written back in 2013. And so then the other piece that I included that I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for. So these are some photos that I got from some of the activists I spoke with who are still working on the ERA, because what I found and what turned into this third story about the states that haven't ratified the ERA yet was I was working on the main story and was sort of looking for an active voice to include. I had sort of a lot of people involved in the broad movement, but I wanted to talk to people who were involved in sort of this on the ground fight. And as I looked into that, I came across a lot of organizations that are still active in states that haven't ratified the ERA, and they're continuing efforts to try and get it done there. So I spoke with women in Virginia and Illinois. So these are some photos from Illinois here that you can see. But also I spoke with women in Arizona, Missouri, South Carolina, all over the place. And that was really interesting because once I spoke to them, there's sort of a twofold point to this is on one hand, a lot of them still consider this to be an ideological issue, that they believe that all 50 states should ratify the ERA and should support it. But on the other side, it is a bit of a practical thing because if those 5 states that rescinded their ratification are considered valid, that means they would need 5 more states to ratify to hit the magic 38 number. And some of these women as well have worked on these issues for decades. You know, I talked to women who were involved in the fight in 1972 and are still doing so now, who speak to like frustration and the difficulties they face on the state level. But the way they continue to persevere was really inspiring and really interesting. It was also interesting to see how things have varied in different states. So these are photos from Arizona. And in Arizona, things are not looking very good. They had made some progress in 2018, but ultimately couldn't get the ratification bill to the floor of the state legislatures. And so they had hoped here in 2020, they wanted to focus on the 2020 election and hope to flip the state legislators to be majority Democrat in the hopes that that would be a more effective strategy of getting the ERA ratified there. And while Arizona did end up going blue for Joe Biden in the presidential race, the state legislatures remained majority Republican. So the women I spoke with say they're sort of trying to reevaluate what is going to be the best strategy, but they're not very optimistic that anything will happen in the immediate future or right now. I also have some photos here. This is in Missouri. And sort of on the other end of the spectrum from Arizona, I would say, is South Carolina, where they are feeling quite optimistic about the ability to ratify the ERA in the coming year. They had made some real progress at the start of this year. The South Carolina State Senate in 2020 had only 4 female senators, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, but all 4 of them had real support for the ERA and were pushing to ratify it. The 4 women had made up a subcommittee of the Senate's Judiciary Committee and held a hearing for the ERA and passed it out of that subcommittee. But unfortunately then, with the pandemic and everything going on, the push really stalled, but they're feeling quite optimistic about their chances of passing it in 2021 in the new legislative session. And so that was really interesting to see how things are still very much moving on the ground in these states, while things have sort of slowed down on the national level for these legal fights. That hasn't slowed down any of these people on the ground. And so to go back to sort of my main story, one real challenge with this project was trying to break down this very dense information and also provide visuals to break up some of the text. The ERA, like I said, sort of starts in 1920, right after the 19th Amendment is adopted. And so that's almost 100 years of history to include. And so trying to be thorough in that without sort of bogging down the main narrative and distracting from the points that I wanted to make was sort of a challenge. And so one of the ways I addressed that was to make this timeline that you can go through and get some of the more specific information. And that also provides a nice visual break in the story as well, which is really nice. Another thing that we did was I made this map here. Can you move things so you can see it? So this shows when all the different states ratified the ERA. It's also a fun interactive thing where you can sort of hover over the different states and see what year they were ratified. You can also here at the bottom, if you want, you can click a specific year or not, just kidding. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I guess that had to reload, but so you can pick a specific year and then it will only show the states that ratified in that year. So that was just another way to try and break down the information and keep the subject matter from being too slow and not as entertaining. So then another sort of challenge that was involved in this was pretty early on in the process. I decided that I really wanted to have all female sources for this story. Part of that happened naturally because as I reached out to different groups who organize on either side of the issue, women were sort of naturally the ones most involved. And so I would sort of send an email to a general email for an organization. And unsurprisingly, it was a woman who got back to me about it and wanted to speak with me. And so as I sort of progressed on this, I was very aware of things that I've discussed in my journalism classes about how women tend to be quoted less in journalism than men. And when women are quoted, they tend to be used as anecdotal sources. So they talk about their personal experiences. They aren't quoted as experts in their field. And so I didn't want this to become an issue of all of the personal stories about why the ERA is important to these people were women, and then switch to sort of the legal expertise coming from men. So I was very intentional in trying to do that. And ultimately, I think it was a benefit. I spoke to two law professors, Julie Soup, who is a law professor at Yale, and she actually wrote a book that came out this year, We the Women, the Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Amendment. And then I spoke with Danae Wright, who is a law professor at the University of Florida, and she has provided research memoranda for some of the amicus briefs filed about the lawsuits related to the ERA. So while it took a little more time to find them, I think ultimately they knew more about the circumstances around the ERA and then made them better sources and helped provide the best information. So now I just want to go a little bit into what I found about what exactly the ERA would do if it was passed and what is sort of the future of the amendment now. So just so we're all on the same page, the actual text of the amendment is here, and that says, Section 1 says that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Section 2, the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. And Section 3, this amendment shall take effect 2 years after the date of ratification. And so, both sides on this debate have very strong opinions about what they think would happen. It's very much a case of them both being at opposite ends of the spectrum. You know, the opposition says that this would mean that the law cannot have any sort of distinction based on sex, and that women would lose any legal protections they have right now, things like being exempt from the draft. The pro-ERA side says that this would make great gains for women's equality in every aspect of life. And unsurprisingly, it is a lot more in the middle, and it's very hard to say now exactly what would happen. A big part of it that we can say now is that it would give Congress much broader powers to pass laws relating to sex discrimination and sex equality. In the past, Congress has passed laws that have been struck down in the courts. For example, there were provisions in the Violence Against Women's Act that were struck down because the courts ruled that Congress did not have the power to enact them. So Congress would have much more power to enact laws to support and enforce gender and sex equality. One way that it would definitively change in the court system is that it would change the way that judges approach cases that have to do with sex discrimination. Right now, the way our lawsuits work is there can be a law passed by a state, and someone can pass a lawsuit saying that it discriminates on the basis of sex, and when the judge evaluates the law, it is subject to what is called intermediate scrutiny, which is sort of a legal bar that it has to pass for the law to be acceptable. And intermediate scrutiny says that a law has to further a governmental interest, and it has to do so by means substantially related to that interest. If the ERA was passed and added to the Constitution, it would change that so those laws would instead be subject to strict scrutiny, which is the highest legal bar. Strict scrutiny says that a law must further a governmental interest and it must be narrowly tailored. So strict scrutiny is applied to suspect classifications, which are things like race and religion. And so the ERA would make sex and gender a suspect classification. So instead, cases related to that would be subject to this higher legal bar of strict scrutiny. But other than that, it is really hard to say exactly what the ERA would do. It is still very much subject to interpretation by judges, and in recent years under the Trump administration, the judiciary has become much more conservative. So it is very hard to say that it would pass and there would be these great strides made immediately. Additionally, no matter what, people have to file lawsuits for things to actually change first, and it's entirely possible that those would have to go up through several courts before a final decision is made, because this would be a new amendment and a new sort of legal debate. So then looking at the future of the ERA, because all of this is based on the assumption that it is actually added to the Constitution, which has not happened yet. The Archivist of the United States is a sort of procedural governmental role, which is the person who certifies and publishes the amendment. And the Archivist has declined to do so for the ERA under the advice of the Department of Justice. However, as I said before, there have been lawsuits filed by both sides about this, saying that the ERA is not valid or that it absolutely is valid and should be in the Constitution already. And those cases center on the debates about this deadline and about the states that rescinded their ratification. This is another issue where there is not going to be a quick sort of ending to the debate, because these lawsuits will take a long time to get to court and to be resolved. It is very likely, according to the people I spoke with, that these lawsuits will go all the way to the Supreme Court. Both sides have invested a lot of time and energy in this so far, so it's very likely that they will appeal it all the way. And it's also pretty likely that the Supreme Court will take it up because they haven't decided an issue on this subject before. And then after that, it gets even harder because we have a relatively new Supreme Court. There have been several justices who have been confirmed in recent years, including Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who was confirmed just this year. And so it's hard to predict exactly how these justices will decide. Plus, these are very weird debates that do not have a lot of legal precedent, which makes it even more unpredictable. Danae Wright, who I spoke to, says that when it comes to the deadline, because the Constitution does not explicitly say that Congress has the power to pass a deadline, it makes it more tricky for conservative justices on the Supreme Court. Most of the conservative justices on the Supreme Court might oppose something like the ERA ideologically, but in their way of approaching judicial precedent, they tend to be textualists, which means that they don't take the interpretation of the law into account. They simply take the law exactly as it is written. So if you're looking at a textualist interpretation of this deadline, it might mean that you say that Constitution doesn't explicitly say that Congress can do it, which means they can't, which then comes directly at odds with the sort of ideological approach that maybe they oppose it. So that's really hard to predict exactly how those justices will decide then. On the other hand, Julie Suk, who I spoke with, pointed out that it's entirely possible that the Supreme Court will say that this decision is outside of its power and outside of its space, and will send it back to Congress actually, and say it is up to the Congress to decide if they can add or remove the deadline, or if these states can rescind their ratification. Similarly, there's not any legal precedent with rescinding the ratification. There is a historical precedent where, with the 14th Amendment, there were several states that tried to rescind their ratification, but Congress just said that those were not valid and that the amendment was added to the Constitution. But it's never been a live legal battle that has been decided in the courts, so it is, again, very uncertain. And similarly, if it goes the way that Suk suggested, that it gets sent back to Congress, we might see sort of a political compromise made by Congress where the ruling might be that the deadline is not valid and can be removed, but the 5 states that rescinded are valid and can't be counted towards the 38. So in conclusion, I was really struck by how strongly everyone involved in this issue still feels about it. I think in the 70s, it was very much in the forefront of people's minds and was very present in like the media attention it got. And that is not really the case right now, but the people directly involved in the issue have the same energy and devotion to the issue now than they did then. And going back to sort of my original goal that I mentioned at the beginning was that I wanted to provide clarity on this issue and a resource to say exactly what would happen if the ERA was passed and what that path would look like. And I'm really pleased with how it turned out on that front. I think that gathering the information was really a great effort, and speaking to people who really lended me excellent expertise, I think that this website is a real resource And I hope that people who read it can sort of understand the movement and the implications of the ERA and get this background for what is at stake in this debate. So I can take any questions now. Thank you all for coming. I don't know, am I supposed to call on people or will someone else call on people?
No, that's it. So okay. I was reading the comments in the chat, but Carlene, we'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Allison. And thank you, Kaitlyn. Working on this with you was such a joy. And the number of people, I really encourage people to look at it. The number of people she spoke with across the country was just astonishing. Some of the older women in the room might remember a name that pops up in the piece, Phyllis Schlafly. And I got very excited when Kaitlyn found Phyllis's daughter and son to interview, because I just grew up with my mother screaming about Phyllis Schlafly in our house every single blessed day. And then so to like sort of figure out, you know, what her kids had to say was interesting to me. Kaitlyn, tell them a little bit about sort of the response that we got from the kids of the icon, Phyllis Schlafly.
Yes, absolutely. So for those of you who aren't aware.
No. Kaitlyn, you're stalled for a sec.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, my internet connection is unstable. I apologize. But so for those of you who don't know, Phyllis Schlafly, I would say, pretty much single-handedly created the movement that stopped the Equal Rights Amendment in the 70s. She kind of came out of nowhere. She founded the original organization was called Stop ERA. Stop then stood for Stop Taking Our Privileges, and really organized this group that had a very strong resistance, obviously, because it stopped the amendment that really hadn't been seen before. And so she was really the central figure in the opposition to the ERA. So as I sort of started doing some research into the opposition, one of the main organizations still involved is called the Eagle Forum, which is a conservative political organization, which was also founded by Phyllis Schlafly back in the 70s and had sort of come out of Stop ERA, and a lot of those people moved from Stop ERA into the Eagle Forum. And the Eagle Forum still lists one of its like main issues as the ERA. They have never stopped paying attention. But so as I sort of went around their website, I came across that Phyllis's daughter, Anne Schlafly Corey, is the chairman of the ERA right now, and had sort of gone like, she would be a great person to interview because I'm sure she's very knowledgeable about this. She has spoken about the issue in recent years. And so I reached out to her, and she was pretty open to speaking to me herself. Originally, Carlene and I had the idea that maybe to do some sort of profile about Anne sort of taking over this issue from her mother and becoming this central figure today. And Anne was happy to talk to me. I think she was just a little confused about what I wanted from her. And then really where we ran into trouble is to try to get other people to talk about her both professionally and personally. I had sort of been like, would you mind giving me some contact information for like your husband or your other family members? And she had kind of said she didn't think they would be comfortable or want to talk to me. And I had kind of struggled to find other professional people to speak to her from that side who had worked with her. I did do some sleuthing online and did find one of her brothers, Roger Schlafly, and spoke to him briefly on the phone, but he was not very helpful. He hadn't kept like really in close touch with Anne and hadn't really followed issues with the ERA. So he was really just kind of confused again about what I was asking for. So that was a little bit upsetting because it would have been a very interesting angle to take on the piece, but ultimately the reporting didn't really pan out.
All right, we have a few more questions. I'm going to go to Meg.
So that's amazing that you were actually able to get in touch with Anne, because I tried and failed for my book project. But so my question for you at first, tremendous job. This is fabulous. You talked a little bit about the implications of the conservative shift of the Supreme Court for the future of the ERA. Do you have any type of sense what this influx of a record number of conservative female lawmakers in Congress might have on the future of this?
That wasn't something I talked specifically with about a lot of people, but it is interesting to see because on the state level, there are certainly states where this is very much a bipartisan effort. Like, as I said, in South Carolina, it really is. There are Republican women who say that this opposition is ridiculous and why wouldn't we want equality of the sexes in the Constitution? On the national scale, I think it gets a little bit harder to sort of resist the party, might sort of be the way I would phrase it. There's a lot more at stake, especially right now. I think there's already a very strong sort of split about within the Republican Party about following sort of the Trump way of things or the way things were before, and how do you balance that line when the party is going with Trump, but maybe personally you oppose it. I will say that the bill in the Senate this year to remove the deadline did have some bipartisan support. I know that Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska supported it, and she is a Republican.
All right, next we have a question from Dan Zedek, who I believe.
Yeah, really terrific work. I was so impressed by the depth and range of your reporting on this, all the people you spoke to and the way you gathered it all together. I also was struck about how, you who's clearly really tapped into these issues was not aware of the ERA. And I was curious if any of your sources had talked about, whether changes in social justice movements or in society more broadly had led to the ERA having less impact or less awareness.
Yeah, definitely. I think that for a long time in like the 90s and the early 2000s, it was sort of only the diehard supporters, I guess, who were still in touch and aware of this. But a lot of the people I spoke with said they saw a real surge of support in recent years. They talked about after the 2016 election of Donald Trump, the Women's March, the Me Too movement, and the confirmation of Justice Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. All of those, multiple people brought up as specific instances that have really increased support for this. It was sort of like, those are like, people became very aware of issues, I think, of gender equality and gender discrimination, and that sort of became this gateway into the movement. And then a lot of people focused that in on the ERA in recent years.
We have one final question from Hannah Bernstein. She put her question in the chat. Did you get the impression that the people currently still working on the ground understand the way the ERA ignores the concerns of Black women? I'm curious if the women currently working on passing it had anything interesting to say about that issue.
Yeah, so I spoke with a couple of people. I think it is, people have a tendency to get a little defensive when you suggest that this issue that they have spent years working on maybe has a bit of a skewed perspective. I think it's also important, to point out that there are women of color and Black women who have absolutely supported the ERA, who absolutely were involved historically in things like the suffrage movement. It's not to say that they don't support this. It's that a lot of them have said in recent years that it's not like an immediate concern. You have Black women who are facing things like police brutality. You have a lot of women around the country facing things like housing insecurity and food insecurity. And these are the most immediate and urgent issues to them. And so then to see this historically over years and years, to see the way some of these major organizations have put all of this time and labor into something like the Equal Rights Amendment that still isn't anywhere close to really crossing the finish line right now is a little disheartening. So I think really for these people, they're looking at it in a very specific case. If you're advocating for the ERA, you are focused just on the ERA. And it's a thing where if you look at it on its own, then you don't see how this is an issue of not prioritizing the issues of women of color. It's when you sort of zoom out and look at this broad scale that you begin to see this trend. And I think that really it's just that some of these people haven't zoomed out like that and tried to look at the trend over time.
Thank you so much, Kaitlyn. That's a fascinating project.
Yes, thanks to everyone for coming.